He says a good bombing is pedagogical. Yeah, we bomb them from the skies. They think we're gods, and that's it. That's going to take a long time to wash away. When a white man rules, it's all great because, as they say in English, it's tickety boo because, you're going to be fair play and all that, old chap. But when you have the natives ruling, they are barbarians. I mean, that's the structure of white supremacy. It's nothing to do with, whether Trump is a nice guy or a bad guy, what his attitude is. That's a superficial analysis, in my opinion. In China, the deference to a white person over other people is extraordinary. I mean, where does that come from? That's despite the immense growth of patriotic sentiment within China. There still is deference. Oh, you're from the United States or whatever. Incredible. If you can't outproduce your rivals, you get them to, you force them, you gunboat diplomacy them to fiddle with the exchange rate, to overvalue the exchange rate so that it becomes too expensive for them to export their goods. This is what the United States did in 1985 with the Plaza Accord against Japan, and then in 1995 in the Reverse Plaza Accord. But Japan, of course, is largely a colony of the US, so it was easy to pressure Japan. China has resisted any valuation of the yuan, of the renminbi against the dollar for decades now. When you had Hong Kong as a colony, I heard so many people on BBC talking about democracy in Hong Kong. So many people. I mean, it was wall-to-wall coverage about the lack of democracy in Hong Kong. Yeah? No, nothing. Because it was an English governor general. And obviously they are fair play and cricket rules and so on. It's only when Hong Kong is delivered to China that it becomes an issue. And then nobody mentions the fact that despite whatever problems there are, Hong Kong and China is the only place I know in the world where there's basically two constitutions, one sovereignty. White supremacy, in a way, is inhumanity. It's hatred of people. In fact, it's not love of whites. It's hatred of all people. Because when you divide humanity in that way, you end up hating people. You end up hating a part of humanity, which is yourself. It sounds a little maybe new agey for some people, but it's also Hegelian. When you divide humanity and hate half of it, you hate a part of yourself, because humanity is a united concept.
No worries.
No worries.
No worries. And actually, that's exactly what we wanted to talk about today. So I sent you the email. I think you saw it. You talked to a Rosa Clemente interview that I saw. It was really, really good. Even though like very few people have, I think, seen that interview. I will share it on our channel, and so that a bit more people can see it. We're still a relatively small channel, but it'll help. And and I think you touch on a very good point that we discuss often on our platform, also on our Substack, and that is, I keep repeating that over and over in my articles, that there is a serious white supremacy problem in the West, but also in anti-imperialist spheres, that just doesn't bring us forward because so many people really, really ignore it. And when you said that that the debate on white supremacy must be had. That's something that you said during that interview, and I was like, yeah, that's what I also always say. So I was like, okay, let's focus on that today. Why that is so important for our anti-imperialism. I think there are not many who can do that as well as you do. And I think Peter.
Can I ask you to? It would be interesting also if you could tell me what you mean by that, because I'm it's a kind of a murky territory when we discuss this, right? So that would be very helpful. Yeah.
Sure. I will suggest a bit what I think is a problem when it comes to anti-imperialism, and then I think Peter wanted to connect that a bit to to start out a bit with the what was it, Peter? The new mood. That was something that you wanted to start with, and
Yeah.
then we shift gears
Yeah.
to the discussion of white supremacy and how that still seems to be a big problem in anti-imperialism, and that also often just doesn't get discussed. And let's just do a bit free flow, and we would just go from there. What do you think?
Okay, great.
Excellent, excellent. So I was so interested to hear your update on the new mood, because I don't know about you, but for the past couple of weeks, it's been a long time since I've been able to follow the news and actually laugh out loud and experience mirth. But I've been experiencing some of that the past couple of weeks because the Trump administration seems dead set on fatally perhaps undermining the US dominated global capitalist system. And there's just been so many things to that have just sent me into spasms of laughter, from Trump blaming the rest of the world for ripping off the US, to the idea that just putting high tariffs is going to serve as an industrial policy to bring back manufacturing to the US. Other great things about it has been there's probably a much lesser chance of a US a war on Iran now that the global economy is so fragile. So there's so many things here, but I just wanted to ask you, this feels like we're in one of those, what is it, weeks or months where decades happen. And so that's why I wanted to ask you for an update on the new mood. You had been describing a new mood around the world, particularly in the global South, a new mood of independence from the US empire, a new mood of experimenting with different forms of economic and political relations between global South countries. Now that Trump has set a set a match to the structure that U.S. capitalists built over the past century or so. How would you say the new mood has been absorbing that? And do you think we might actually see a development in the rest of the world that would allow this moment of opportunity to perhaps be the moment when the U.S.-led capitalist empire is replaced by something better?
I mean, in a sense, if you give up the axiomatic or knee-jerk dislike for Mr. Trump, if you just sort of set that aside, Trump is just everything about him is horrible, and I am not at all a believer that Trump is doing good, or that. Just let's just get rid of all that so we can actually get to the movement of history. In fact, Mr. Trump is doing something really quite interesting as far as I can see. He's using very cleverly real grievances that are felt by the masses of people in the United States around the social impact of globalization to basically, and these are real grievances that people are facing now. So they are short-term grievances. People are like, I don't have a job. What's the point of me borrowing money from China to buy stuff that's produced in China? I'll never be able to pay it back. Trillions of dollars of debt, and so on. That's a short-term, real pain that people are facing. Okay, so that's one. He's using that to basically consolidate the long-term interests of American capital. And that's a really clever trick that he's playing. What are the long-term interests of American capital? I mean, we know that the most productive sectors of capital are going to be in technology, various forms of high tech. In fact, it's not all communications, it's various forms of high tech, including transportation and so on. Anyway, and also production, new forms of production, how to produce goods and services, whether it's dark factories, robotic factories, artificial intelligence things. He knows that that's the future. He's not stupid. We know that's the future. And he knows that future is already taking place in East Asia, if not in other parts of Asia. It's already there. I mean, I visited dark factories in China. They're incredible. The whole factory is robotized. You have not one person. The only workers there are people in lab coats. They look like scientists. I visited a cherry tomato greenhouse factory with, I think 80% robotized. It was incredible. This is the future. Now, it's not the future for everybody because in Burkina Faso, rural electrification is just under 10%. So you can't have robot factories there. But still, it's what we can anticipate. Trump needs to, somehow get the American economy in line with that future. And that's not happening. But he can't get the American capitalists on board to invest sufficiently in the US, to make this happen. So what is he doing? He's doing a gambit, which the US has tried for the last 15 years and failed to do, which is that if you can't outproduce your rivals, you get them to, you force them, you gunboat diplomacy them to fiddle with the exchange rate, to overvalue the exchange rate so that it becomes too expensive for them to export their goods. This is what the United States did in 1985 with the Plaza Accord against Japan, and then in 1995 in the Reverse Plaza Accord. But Japan, of course, is largely a colony of the US, so it was easy to pressure Japan. China has resisted any valuation of the yuan, of the renminbi against the dollar for decades now. Okay, this is something that, from the late Clinton administration, there was a pressure on China, evaluate your yuan, renminbi, and they just say no. And this is a gambit to pressure them, to make it worthwhile for capital to invest in the US, because then exports from the US could get cheaper and whatnot. He has a problem, which is he has this short-term crisis, but he needs to solve a long-term problem. And that's what he's trying to do. And, it's interesting to watch him try to do that because in a sense, Peter, unlike, let's say, Biden before him, Trump understands the gravity of the problem. What Biden tried to do, seeing this issue, was to put a lot of government spending into infrastructure and therefore industrialization, with the big investment act and so on, which the Republicans refused to pass. Yeah, I mean, I never understood why they wouldn't put that through, like cut all social spending, put your money into infrastructure that benefits capital. Like, why wouldn't you do that? No, they just put their foot down, refused. They said, we can't increase, unless there are cuts, you can't do that. And Democrats weren't going to do the cuts, yeah? They should have come with a counter proposal, a savage, nasty counter proposal. That's exactly what Trump is doing. He has a nasty, savage counter proposal to save capital, but in saving capital, to tell the American masses that I am going to solve your short-term problem, which is that you don't have a job. And so we're going to bring manufacturing back. It's a pretty interesting gambit. Will it succeed? No, it's not going to succeed. What else is the American administrative class to do, though, but try this? I don't know any other way. One way is just to say, okay, let's slip into a fourth-ranked country, because we are so heavily in debt and so on. The final thing, Peter, that's important is the US has paid a price for being the global currency. They have paid a price. They had to give up capital controls, open up their assets to the global rich. They had to allow their rich to take the money out and so on. And that's hollowed out the country. They have paid a price. We should thank the United States for, to some extent, doing this service to the global economy by producing, the global currency. Nobody else wants to take up that job, Peter. If it was so beneficial, why aren't there people lining up? It's got a downside. You hollow out your economy. Yeah, nobody wants to follow the dollar. Certainly the yuan is not going to do it. The euro is not capable. And nobody's come up with a good basket of currency solution. I just don't think basket of currency solution is credible immediately, maybe in the future. Now it's not credible. So yeah, I mean, okay, I get it. Let's laugh. But on the other hand, if you just take away the insanity, the rational kernel, this seems like a pretty rational thing to attempt. I just don't think it's going to work. That doesn't mean it's not a rational thing to attempt.
Yeah, for sure. It's just that, like you said, it's not going to work. And there are alternatives that could be used. There would have to be a page one rewrite of the US political economic system, which is not going to happen because the people who own that system don't want it to change. But at any rate, I just thought that would be a good segue into the broader concern that Kareem is going to lead the discussion into, because you mentioned first define white supremacy. So I'll let Kareem do that for how he uses it. But there are certainly people who include within that term, they make it extremely expansive so that it includes the US-led global capitalist system. And in that sense, there's the connection between the US under Trump flirting with setting it all on fire. Now, that, of course, assumes that the rest of the world will build something in its place. And that's a very much an open question. But for people who want to see that system replaced, now has been, one of the better times for hopes. Not exactly Mao's everything under heaven is in chaos. The situation is excellent, but we're flirting with getting there. So, Kareem, do you want to start off on the main track? Oh, you're muted.
Whoops. Okay, here I am. Yeah, Vijay, Vijay, I saw one of your recent interviews with a lady called Rosa Clemente, and that was a very interesting interview. I liked it a lot. I will link to it in the description for our audience. And you said something that I found very important, namely that you very clearly stated that a debate needs to be had about recurring white supremacy in our world. And I totally agree with that. In our on our channel and our Substack, we discuss it a lot: racism and white supremacy. I always say it's a central phenomenon, central factor in anti-imperialism that needs to be included in our analysis. That is often lacking, in my opinion, in many Western independent media channels that discuss issues of anti-imperialism. That's why we often also interview a historian called Professor Gerald Horn. He often centralizes white supremacy as a problem, which he sees as a kind of settler solidarity that you see not only within our societies, such as the United States, but also between societies, such as between United States and Israel and other parts of the world. And I agree with that conception, that kind of settler solidarity that you also see in the international states, that kind of colonial solidarity that is still rooted in the idea that white people, white ruling classes should also rule the international system. Now, you have argued that Trump isn't an unusual character, and you're very similar to Gerald Horne in that sense. You said that Trump is not an unusual character, but rather represents recurring waves of white supremacy. How do you respond to those who see him as an anomaly rather than a part of a historical pattern?
I mean, let's just take his predecessor, Joe Biden. I mean, why go back to, I don't know where, Jimmy Carter or something? Let's just take Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden was incensed about the war in Europe, where the war was between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And anytime a Ukrainian died, the United States, would be fulminating about it. Meanwhile, the United States participated, and so did the United Kingdom, in the destructive genocidal campaign against the Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, look, the Israelis have just admitted that on March 23rd, one of their battalions went into southern Gaza and massacred unarmed health workers, emergency workers, 15 of them, buried them in a shallow grave, destroyed their vehicles to get rid of the crime, and so on. I mean, it's a war crime. They were unarmed. They were killed, in captivity. And they tried to cover it up. So the commanding officer was reprimanded, And the officer who actually conducted this activity was dismissed from the military. That's how they deal with a savage war crime. Had this been a crime against one European, it would have been like horrible. And this was reported in the Financial Times pretty matter of factly, like as if this is a correct way to punish somebody for killing 15 health workers, and burying them in a shallow grave, not allowing their family to know where they are, and so on. I mean, that's the reason why when you kill somebody, you don't bury them in a shallow grave, is so that there's closure for the family members and so on. You admit to what you've done. No, they tried to cover the whole thing up. They smashed up the vehicles. I mean, that's a sign of what I think of as the international division of humanity. I mean, that's Joe Biden, who's supposed to be the liberal. So how is that different from Trump? I mean, okay, you can say Trump is more grotesque in his language. Okay, fine, I'll concede that, grotesque in the language. I mean, yeah, but your actions are the same. So what does it really matter? I mean, I get it. Words hurt. I mean, I'm not callous like that. I get it that words hurt and so on, but actions hurt more. I mean, words hurt when there are no actions. Then it's worse to have harsher words. But if your actions are the same, doesn't matter what your words are. It's irrelevant. It's moot, in fact. Yeah. So in that sense, what's the anomaly? I don't get it. I really don't get it. Let's go back to Jimmy Carter, who had, a funeral much like we're going to see with Pope Francis. It was just lauded like a great hero of liberalism. Carter was brutal when it came to the Nicaraguan revolution. They mined the port of Managua. He later regretted his behavior towards the Palestinians. But when he was president, he had the international division of humanity front and center. Let's take Bill Clinton, the other apostle of American liberalism, just bombed a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan just because he could. The Al-Shifa factory, the only factory in Sudan that made a whole set of drugs for large parts of Africa, never rebuilt it, even though they realized they had bombed a factory. Maybe they knew beforehand. It's hard to tell. They didn't reveal any information. Yeah. Where's the difference? I mean, this is a structure of white supremacy. It's not an attitude merely. Yeah. I mean, again, structures produce attitudes. But sometimes you can have an attitude without a structure. It can be an anachronistic attitude. So the structure has changed, but the attitudes remain like a residue in the air. Yeah, but here the structure is there. I mean, let's talk to Britain about its foreign policy. Let's talk to the BBC how it deals with Hong Kong. When you had Hong Kong as a colony, I heard so many people on BBC talking about democracy in Hong Kong. So many people. I mean, it was wall-to-wall coverage about the lack of democracy in Hong Kong. Yeah? No, nothing. Because it was an English Governor General. And obviously, they are fair play and cricket rules and so on. It's only when Hong Kong is delivered to China that it becomes an issue. And then nobody mentions the fact that despite whatever problems there are, Hong Kong and China is the only place I know in the world where there's basically two constitutions, one sovereignty. I don't know any place like that. Okay, it's bizarre. If I was the Chinese government, I would say it's one country. What are you talking about? Tiny little place? You're going to have your own rules? Ridiculous, I don't know why they are respecting the terms of transition. I wouldn't respect them. The Indian government invaded Goa to bring Goa back from Portugal. They invaded Goa. They sent the army in, just brought it into the Indian. There was no question of special rules for Goa, whatever nonsense. But, this is an interesting feature. The last Governor General of Hong Kong goes on BBC, talks about, democracy in Hong Kong. It's ridiculous, Chris Patton. Why didn't you deliver democracy when you were the ultimate ruler? Well, that's the international division of humanity. When a white man rules, it's all great because, as they say in English, it's tickety-boo because, you're going to be fair play and all that, old chap. But when you have the natives ruling, they are barbarians. I mean, that's the structure of white supremacy. It's nothing to do with, whether Trump is a nice guy or a bad guy, what his attitude is. That's a superficial analysis, in my opinion.
Yeah,
to
very
just go
well
back
said.
to the definitional issue, how are we defining white supremacy in this conversation?
Let's ask Kareem that, because that would be a better place to start in a way. I'm scared of defining this.
Yeah, I also find it very, very scary to define actually, because you can see it in many ways. You can see it in a very individualistic, psychological kind of way where you just react differently on people who are classified as white. And that, of course, comes from the fact that we live in structures, like Vijay just said, that that continuously condition us to react differently to people classified as white versus people who are classified as not white. So indeed, when a lot of people see Ukrainian victims, they respond very differently based on what kind of ethnicity they see suffering. You know what I mean? Versus somebody who looks Middle Eastern. Or black or any other group classified as not white. So in that sense, white supremacy, you could see it in a very psychological sense, but you can also see it also in a very structural sense. How capitalism continuously reproduces power structures in a way that continuously keeps people classified as white at the top. We have a global system where capitalism is structured in such a way that now 500-600 years later, still capital maintains within people that you can classify as white. I mean, just to type on Google the 10 or 20 or 50 richest people in the world, and almost everybody looks white. There's a reason for that. There's a structural reason why you see that. And that means also that that system apparently reproduces and maintains itself. And that is not only, and again, that is an interplay between those structural components and these psychological components that also are not only influenced by these structures, but in aggregate reproduce those structures. I mean, think about hiring practices. Think about people that you collaborate with. Think about the countries you support versus not support, etc., etc. So in that sense, it's very complex, but it's everywhere, and I find it so important to really discuss that and understand that and unpack that in anti-imperialist spheres. Otherwise, we get nowhere. To give you an example, on a very micro level, for example, when we think about anti-imperialism, there are many very well-known anti-imperialist media channels, for example, on YouTube and other parts of the web. And often you would see that these channels have this kind of white supremacist undercurrent that people are not aware of. They only get white guests. They mostly discuss issues that are more important to, for example, Western audiences. Think about Ukraine versus Palestine. And often also discuss things from a supremacist kind of standpoint. That is, that telling other societies how they should behave, for example, during the whole Syria debacle, you had a lot of anti-imperialist channels saying that, these Palestinians, they're congratulating the overthrow of Assad. They ask for the problems, they ask for their own problems. How can they congratulate Syrians because of that? And another aspect, for example, what you also often see in anti-imperialist spheres is that they often celebrate politicians such as Viktor Orban, but also the AfD in Germany, because they have some anti-imperialist stances, while they completely ignore the vile racism of these politicians that actually maintain that kind of unequal structure of white supremacy. That, of course, is connected to the unequal class structure that we see around the world. Now, you said something very important in one of your interviews, and maybe that touches on what I just said. You said that class analysis and anti-racism work actually intersect. Okay, these are two things that are intertwined, and I totally agree with that. And that would also be something that Gerald Horne always says. And you mentioned the failure of the left, the Western left, to address both of these issues together. And that is also something that really frustrates me, as if like racism is some kind of liberal issue that you can just exclude because it's all about class. But the two are so intrinsically connected. And discussing anti-imperialism only based on class without a racial analysis is, in my opinion, completely useless. So, before I talk too long, Vijay, can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, firstly, I think Peter will agree with me. I'm glad that you went before me because, your own training allows you to bring these two, in a sense, analytical frameworks together, the psychosocial and the political economic, and bringing them together, I think is important because there's a tendency, for one to abstract out from the other. There are lots of people who emphasize the psychosocial, others that will emphasize the political economic. But in fact, we are interested in the whole, and these are together. I would just throw in that there is the taproot of culture, which is so deep and vicious, and how many kids when they play cowboys and Indians want to be the Indians? That's the taproot of culture. It's super deep in our societies. As you said, ideas of beauty, ideas of intelligence, artificial intelligence learning about what is good and what is bad, white is good, black is bad, and so on. Okay, all of that. Yes, 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 and yes. Now, the issue is we have inherited an understanding of in the kind of discourse of the left. We've inherited a very strong tradition of anti-colonialism. And underneath this anti-colonial tradition, there's a feeling which I sometimes think is lacking in scholars, even in people who are online talking about these things, and that is the love of the mass of people. We forget that anti-colonial movements were mass movements, which were about the love of people. It's not just like what Benedict Anderson writes, that nations are constructed through newspapers and print capitalism and people, getting to know the map and so on. It's actually built out of a very interesting form of love for your fellow person. Which is why I felt that anti-colonial nationalism is a step towards humanism. We were taught to love our countrymen. The songs that we sang were patriotic songs of love of country and people, other people in the country. Now, there's a limit to this, and the limit is class, that you love your countrymen abstractly, but you don't love the person who is begging, on the street and so on. The limit becomes class for that. The middle class has resentments and hatreds and it marinates in them. So it's not like these are all beautiful perfections and in some anti-colonial nirvana, everybody loves each other. There are, of course, limits and there are inheritances of caste, for instance, or, but we can see the example of the Chinese Revolution, where after 1949, they ran roughshod over a lot of the old inherited hierarchies. They just said, sorry, no foot binding. Sorry, we're not going to bow down to you, landlord. It's just not going to happen. We love everybody. And in fact, in China, there is a remarkable culture of people, they have a great pride in where they come from. My food is better than your food. We have the best delicacies and so on. But there's a real pride in being Chinese. In India, you have some of this, but it's undercut by the old hierarchies, which haven't been worn down. Why am I saying all this? Because when people enter, let's say, the politics of the left or the politics of taking a stance away from capitalism, sometimes they hate capitalism but don't love people. And that's what actually provokes some of these feelings. It's too mechanical, how could you say such an unfeeling thing? When there are people who say, well, Trump will be good for the world, that is an unfeeling, mechanical way to look at the world. He is going to be terrible. A lot of people are going to suffer more under his shenanigans, like the Yemenis right now, the bombardment of Yemen, ruthless. This sort of heartlessness, which has entered sections of the mechanical political class, let's say, is something to pay attention to, because in a sense, the critique of white supremacy is the critique of inhumanity. And the standpoint of that critique has to be humanity, has to be a great capacity for love for people. Hey, listen, I don't like lots of people, but I should have the capacity to love everybody. And I should have the capacity in my thinking not to be callous about people's suffering. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Is I'm glad you defined white supremacy the way you did. But I would like to add to it that white supremacy, in a way, is inhumanity. It's hatred of people. In fact, it's not love of whites. It's hatred of all people. Because when you divide humanity in that way, you end up hating people. You end up hating a part of humanity, which is yourself. It sounds a little maybe new agey for some people, but it's also Hegelian. When you divide humanity and hate half of it, you hate a part of yourself, because humanity is a united concept, and that's a real thing. And I feel very strongly that sometimes bad analyses, like you mentioned, come from a lack of consideration of suffering, and how people like ourselves should never allow suffering to be taken callously. Suffering is terrible, regardless of whether your politics benefits from suffering or not, because sometimes it might. Maybe there's a contradiction. There's a short-term pain which produces new kinds of politics, but that doesn't give me any joy. It never should, because that then brings you into the discourse of white supremacy. Let's not even call it white supremacy. It's a form of supremacist thinking, which I think is terrible. One has to have the capacity to love humans. Otherwise, you just can't be in this kind of politics.
Yeah. It made me think of two things. Like when you're talking about nationalism and how nationalism can have positive effects, in the context of anti-colonial struggle, I think of Che Guevara saying something like the defining characteristic of the revolutionary is love. That's the motivating force to engage in that kind of risk your life for making a better place to live. And then Mao had this great line where he just said something like, in wars of national liberation, nationalism becomes internationalism in application. So the implication there is like, yeah, nationalism is for monkeys. Like, intelligent people don't, I mean, that's insulting to monkeys who aren't nationalists, but you know what I mean? No intelligent person is going to be nationalistic, but in the context of a struggle for national liberation, then that kind of bond, that in-group bond with people just in the imagined community of the nation becomes what internationalists would want to do in that context. But anyway, sorry, that was a little bit of a diversion.
Oh, quotations from Che and Mao are never a diversion. They are not even decoration. Okay, they are important. I mean, it is true, and it's fun because today I got the cover for my Darker Nations book from ages back, finally translated into Bhasha Indonesian. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that in that book I'd written about how anti-colonial nationalism is always internationalist nationalism. It sounds like a contradiction, but it's not a contradiction. I mean, it's only a contradiction, again, if you're mechanical. You can be a nationalist. You can love your people, but also love humanity. It's not a contradiction. It's weird that...
And it becomes, of course, a problem if a nation state is tied to race or ethnicity, which the Europeans did. That's a big problem. That really messed it up.
But then you're not a nationalist. Then you're a supremacist, in a way. I mean, we don't need to quibble with these things. I agree. It's a kind of nationalism, but it's supremacism that predominates over any other form of thinking. The feeling that we are superior, and supremacism has its ugliness. Whatever kind of supremacism, again, it could be on lines of gender, it could be on lines of caste, on race, and so on. The different forms of supremacism. Yeah, I mean, all of them equally hideous in my opinion. And I mean the word hideous. Like, they are ugly, man. They are ugly forms of thinking. I've never found it attractive in anybody when somebody says something nasty. It's just not attractive. Like, come on, man. I get it. Six guys sitting in a room talking smack, but it's not attractive. It's just not attractive.
Yeah, I always wonder as a social psychologist myself, supremacism is a problem, but how do you wrench it out in a society, in a capitalist society that conditions us to be supremacists since we are in primary school and even earlier? I mean, with grades and better schools and competition. I mean, supremacism is it's baked into our capitalist system because some people get more, some people get less, and it's such a problematic thing. And I remember in your interview also you said that this civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter, you said, loosened the carrot of supremacism, of white supremacy, for example, but did not completely wrench it out. I know this is a difficult question, but what, in your opinion, in the capitalist world that we are in now, what would truly wrench it out, in your opinion, and what would that look like?
I mean, it's a sequential issue. One is, I know from my own experience that nobody is capable of being post-supremacist. We all carry this in us. It's in our habits, it's in our demeanor, because it's part of the culture. As I said, the tap root of racism is deeper than one imagines. Yeah. But when you join struggles of different kinds, it really helps to get the plaque moving. And like brushing your teeth every day, the more you struggle, the more you are able to work on yourself as well, and yourself in community with others. I mean, it's a little bit like the Islamic concept. And I'm sorry to bring this up because I know it's got a bad name now in the English language, but it's a lot like the jihad. I mean, the lesser jihad, in fact, is the jihad out there. The greater jihad is against yourself. That's the greater jihad. You'd think the lesser was on yourself. No, in Islamic tradition, the greater jihad is the struggle with yourself to make yourself a better Muslim. The lesser jihad is to try to convince others to be Muslims. That's interesting. For me, the greatest struggle is with oneself. And that's why it's important for people to be in struggle, to be in community. These things are important. They're not superficial. But also, you're right that structures need to be altered. And that is the reason why it's very difficult to see, a complete reversal of supremacism under a capitalist system. It's very difficult. But we have interesting examples during the experiments in the DDR, in the German Democratic Republic, even in the USSR, in Cuba. The attempts to build a post-supremacist system, I think, bore some fruit. The mass literacy campaigns, the schooling where there's no private schooling. Where you make an attempt. I mean, what always happens, and it happened in all these experiments, is that there is always school number one, the best school. It's going to happen in the interim period. Yeah, it's going to happen. Okay, in Amsterdam, there was a time when they said, okay, all bicycles are free. And they painted them white and you could just take a bike. And then what people did was they saw a really good bike. And so they took it up into their apartment and saved it there and brought it down. And I mean, This kind of thing happens in the short term. But over time, and I mean hundreds of years, our attitudes will change. This is not a short term fix. It's going to take a long time. Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth says something very interesting. He says, Marxism has to be slightly stretched. I really like that phrase, slightly stretched. What he means is that Marxism hasn't really taken hold of some of these issues of race and so on properly. He's writing in 1961. It has to be slightly stretched. You've got to really incorporate, these ideas in there, in the sense that take the Cuban Revolution, took place in 1959. It took decades for the Cuban Revolution to directly understand that you can't just by fiat say that race is ended. You're going to have to create a commission to study the reproduction of racism. You got to look at the books. You got to look at everything. And the committee is still functioning. It's a permanent committee. Like they had a permanent committee on gender. It took decades for the Cuban Revolution to come to terms with sexuality. And now Cuba has one of the world's best family laws, which allows, all kinds of things which are not permitted in the so-called freest of democracies. Yeah. But it took a long time. It's not, it's not like you had the Cuban Revolution 1959 and the next day they had a liberated Afghanistan. You had the Saur Revolution 1978. The new Afghan government actually pushed in 1978 and 79 extremely liberated forms of social life. For instance, anybody can divorce. It doesn't have to be initiated by a man. I mean, enormously progressive. That was pushed by my friend Anahita Ratevzad. And my God, the United States used all that to rile up the mullahs against the government. It's not easy to change culture. It is really not easy. And anybody who thinks you can just do it by policy doesn't understand the difference between society and culture. You can, with policy, change social norms. If you had, for instance, creches or daycare centers, then children can go to free daycare centers. That actually eases things up for women. That changes some elements of family life. Okay. So that changes some social norms, social pressure. It doesn't change culture. Patriarchy has to still be confronted frontally. Because a woman has an extra hour in the day, it doesn't mean that that goes to her leisure. Patriarchy is still going to try to squeeze that into reproductive labor of some kind or the other. Yeah. So we should never misunderstand how policy can change social practices, but not necessarily culture. Culture needs its own smash. And so when we talk about white supremacy or forms of supremacist thinking, this is a long-term struggle. I mean, to turn around and criticize, let's say, a project that's trying to build, something emancipatory and say, well, you haven't done this. Man, don't have a superficial attitude towards culture. It's very hard to change culture. You can't look at Burkina Faso today where, the government is saying we're going to do all these things. Government saying we're going to do all these things doesn't change Burkinabe culture. That's going to take generations. Yeah, and I don't want to say, oh, well, then just, lump it. No, struggle. That's the two things. Struggle and take power.
Yeah, I agree broadly that it's quite difficult to change deep-rooted aspects of cultures. Racism can be one of those things. Sexism is almost always. But I think structural change can have some fairly fast impacts on, I guess, what you would categorize in the social realm. I think of this short story by the sci-fi fiction writer Thomas Dish, I think his name is, and it's about this American couple who are traveling in Morocco, and they're enjoying the deference of all around them. That's more the psychological aspect of what Kareem was talking about in terms of white supremacy, but also the economic aspect. How can they afford to go to Morocco? Well, because they're citizens of the imperial hegemon. So the economic system is structured such that they can, on a modest salary, enjoy a lavish vacation in Morocco where people serve on them hand and foot. But in the story, a nuclear exchange between the US and USSR occurs, and all of a sudden, their status drops from the masters of the universe in Morocco to poor, penniless beggars who can't access any of their accounts anymore. So I'm not saying that we're going to see a nuclear exchange between the U.S. and Russia now, or any other country to precipitate this, but rather in a much slower, relatively way. If the foundations of U.S. hegemony are fatally shaken by current events, then I think we'll see in the structure a very quick, in some ways, readjustment where people no longer look at Americans primarily, but I guess that would bleed into just whites more broadly, a very different perspective. But that leads to a question I'd be interested to hear your perspective on. So in this current trade war, the latest move has been Trump basically attempting to put the rest of the world on the U.S. side by negotiating individual bilateral tariff deals, and then sticking China with God knows what it's up to now, 145%, 245%, whatever, make it an infinity percent. Now, if that is the shape that this if the current direction continues, and it's largely a U.S. China bipolar struggle, and a lot of observers, myself included, think that the Chinese economic system is actually better suited, better prepared for this sort of a tariff war than the U.S. system. If that eventuality actually happens, and I'm not entirely confident. I think it's much more likely that the Congress would revolt, as unlikely as that seems right now politically, if U.S. hegemony were seriously threatened, imminently rather threatened. So just putting that out there, or he would be assassinated. I don't think he'll be allowed to completely destroy the foundations of U.S. hegemony. But let's imagine that he's not. Congress remains quiescent. There's no assassination. Trump continues on the current path, undeterred, and the result is that the U.S. ends up in a far weaker position globally relative to China. How do you think that would? What do you think the ripple effects in societies around the world and the global economic system would be?
And white supremacy, and white supremacy.
Yeah, white supremacy. I mean, one thing is I'm pretty schematic about this. I think of this like a layer cake. Political change happens very fast. Economic change, not as fast as political change, but it can happen pretty fast. Yeah. Social change with policies that I mentioned earlier can happen pretty quickly. Cultural change takes a long time. The British imperialists understood that. When in the 19th century, the British imperialists decided that, look, we're not going to allow British people to get old in India. We don't want the Indians to see us feeble and old. So after a certain age, you got to go back to England. There's going to be no sanatoriums for British here. Yeah. And for a time, they didn't allow women in India. I used to read these when I was doing my PhD, these documents where the British would describe how they went into rural areas to meet the peasants. What they would do is that they would send an advance party into the rural area where they would take a table and a chair and so on, and an umbrella. And so way in the middle of the interior, in the middle of the fields, they would set up effectively an office, like an outdoor office. And then the British, the district commissioner or the local judge and jury and executioner, the main dictator of the area, would drink his beer, which is what they had for breakfast in the British colonies, eat his steak, and eggs and whatever, then get on his horse and ride right up to that table, dismount, and march to the desk and sit down there to demonstrate his authority and superiority. And the natives had to sit down in a line, waiting penitently to meet him. The theater of it was incredible. They spent a lot of time building the concept of supremacy. They
Like
took
a
a lot of
samurai
time.
almost in Japan. The samurai did that too.
It's really difficult because none of this is normal. Yeah, they spent a lot of time and energy. When they fell ill, they went into seclusion. They didn't allow people to see them sick. When the officers fell ill, went to seclusion. They frequently kept white nurses to nurse them. They were the special nurses and so on. They just didn't want to be seen as feeble. This was the manufacturing of Superman, in a way. Anyway, why am I saying that? Because in a way, there is such a depth of feeling that we all have. We all have it. In China, the deference to a white person over other people is extraordinary. I mean, where does that come from? That's despite the immense growth of patriotic sentiment within China. There still is deference. Oh, you're from the United States or whatever. The incredible sentiment that still exists. Yeah. In India, it's there. It's not going anywhere. Again, despite the new mood, which says that we don't want to take orders from you, to individual people, the Superman has appeared. It's going to take a long time. I just feel like these changes in the world economy, the emergence of China and so on, again, politics is going to change, economics is going to change, maybe to some extent even social situation will change. In other words, you have a Chinese tourist arrive in Thailand and you have a white tourist, not necessarily that the hotel is going to turn to the white tourist and say, can I help you first? Now they may turn to the Chinese tourist. That's social change, not cultural. Social change because they are having to deal with the fact that these people have more money and they might in fact bring more customers and whatnot. It's a whole different. But culturally, they may feel the pressure of like, oh my God, this is a white person. We should serve them first. It is going to take time. That's all I'm saying, Peter. That even with major changes, it's going to take time. Let's rewind for a little bit. Yeah, I don't know if you read what's his name, Rory Stewart's book on Afghanistan. He's the Englishman who, was like the swashbuckling fellow who goes to Afghanistan, and then he eventually becomes a Tory MP, and so on. Anyway, but if you read his books on the war on terror, it's clear that, as an Englishman, he jumps ahead of the queue of Americans when he's in parts of the Arab world. Because people are like, oh, you're English, you get it. You understand colonialism. You understand us. Americans, they understand hamburgers. I mean, this is 3 generations or more after the end of British rule east of the Suez. I mean, for God's sake, where is this coming from? So I am confident that there's already a sell-by date. There's a expiration date for this kind of supremacy. That expiration date is there. I mean, I can't tell you the date, but I know there's a date on the label. If I knew the date, I would bet on it, make money. Don't know that, but it's there. It's just that it's not there now. And we will see financial changes. The center of gravity of the world economy is already moved, all of that. But these other changes will lag, and they will lag considerably. They will lag considerably because it is hard to wipe out some of these histories. Why is it that from 1855 until the 1890s, the sultans of Siam and Malaya and Cochin China and so on all just told the British, hey, listen, and French, you are our overlords, just let us stay in power. Why? Because they saw what they had done to India. If you can take India, you can take anything. If you can take Indonesia, you can take it. They just surrendered. They barely fought them. That's the root of white supremacy, was the cannon, was the Gatling gun. Yeah, I mean, on the African continent, the Gatling gun, the repeater gun, in the hill tribes of Iraq all the way to Waziristan, the aircraft, aerial bombardment, that produced supremacy. Arthur Bomber Harris, what does he say? He says a good bombing is pedagogical. Yeah, we bomb them from the skies. They think we're gods, and that's it. That's going to take a long time to wash away.
And they try, of course, to maintain that now in Israel Palestine. I mean, that is the most brutal, blatant kind of supremacism through violence that you can imagine. Just bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb. Syria, Lebanon, let them see we are the most brutal people in the world. And I am hoping that we live in a day and age, indeed, that is not gonna result in another 600 years of white supremacy. But it is actually now turning into a self-destructive kind of phenomenon. So I find it very, very, very fitting that you say that white supremacy comes through bombs and guns, and that is so true. And I also, somebody living in China, of course, I totally agree with you that on a more micro cultural level, white supremacy. I always say in my classes when I teach, for example, global inequality and how that relates to psychology, I always say that white supremacy is a global phenomenon. Even in societies that have not formally been colonized, such as Japan, China, Thailand. Why? Because again, and there you see that relationship with the structure. If you go to Hollywood movies, the cinema, you put on the television, you have the algorithms on internet. It still conditions you to be white supremacist, and it takes a lot of time when that cultural, structural, systemic conditioning stops making us as individuals white supremacists. And for that, of course, we need that economic change, as you just said, in China, and that takes a while.
Yeah,
Hopefully
I mean,
not
no
too
doubt
long.
about that. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Okay, like I'm not, as I said, there's an expiration date. We just don't know when, and I've come to understand, with a lot of things that all the final goals are going to come. I mean, I want to win on everything, but I might not be around to see a lot of these things, but we can detect them. And I think that's the important part of it. We can detect the changes. And, we're at the 70-year mark of Bandung. At Bandung, they were saying the same things. Yeah. If you read the final communique of Bandung, it's really interesting because people focus frequently on the political and economic parts of the agenda. You should read the cultural part. It's actually far more interesting in a sense. Why?
Just for our
It's
audience,
19...
Vijay,
Yeah,
sorry for interrupting, Vijay. Just
yeah,
for our
yeah.
audience, you're
No,
talking about the Bandung Conference, right?
yes, exactly. In 1955, 29 countries from Africa and Asia. I mean, it's amazing. It's just like 5, 6 years after they had won their independence, after very strong struggles, come to Indonesia. And, different political views, by the way, right of center anti-communists like Sir John Kotawala of Sri Lanka, of Ceylon then, Zhou Enlai of China. I mean, really, you couldn't have more divergent political figures gathering then, yet they came up with a really good communique. The last part of the communique is on culture, and it's on what they call racialism, the term of that period, very strong condemnation of racism. And it's interesting because they understood that colonialism was about racism. It's not just about, political domination. And in that period, very interestingly, UNESCO, the UN Education, Social and Cultural Organization, was actually founded in Paris. UNESCO was founded with an agenda of trying to go after the deep roots of racism. Some of the earliest UNESCO texts, they got the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, for instance, to write a book on what is racism for them, which is, I think, one of his least known books. It's a book published by UNESCO. They wanted to go after racism. We're talking now, the late 40s and into the 50s. So these people understood this problem, but I think they also, like Peter, were eager and were like, I hope it doesn't take too long, because they had to live in the world. Yeah. And they didn't want to live in that world. They would have to go as heads of government and meet their former colonial masters. I mean, it's within that generation. Yeah, within that generation, that the nasty Winston Churchill said of Gandhi, I'm not going to allow that half-naked fakir to enter the king's palace. That was that generation. It's not a previous generation. Understand? I mean, Winston Churchill is basically the generation of these leaders. Yeah, these are nasty people. They did the Malaya emergency, where they did the attack on the Mau Mau in Kenya. It was happening simultaneously with the Bandung conference. And the Americans who conducted the coup against Lumumba, then against Gulat in Brazil, then against Sukarno in Indonesia. Yeah, the attempt to kill Chou En-lai when he flies to Bandung, the first plane which he was supposed to be on crashed. It was very mysterious circumstances. Nasty people, their generation, they had to meet them as equals at the UN. Yeah. So, Peter, your, urgency was their urgency. I understand the urgency. I just think now, 70 years later, it's becoming clearer and clearer, I think, through scholarly literature, through the work that you guys do, sociological work on the really deep roots of some of this thinking, that it's difficult. I mean, firstly, until there's a frontal assault on it, and look at this in the United States, the rejection of so-called DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yeah, the attack by the right wing on diversity, equity, inclusion, because they know it's making gains. It's making gains. The Financial Times wrote an editorial where they said US universities need to stand up to Trump, et cetera, the correct liberal things. By the way, the Financial Times is my favorite capitalist newspaper. So, I'm saying this out of love for them. They say all the correct liberal things that, it's appalling what Trump is doing. But then they say, but the left has gone too far, that there needs to be an adjustment. This diversity, equity, inclusion, it's gone too far. Well,
woke. Everything's woke these days.
Karim, your whole career is built on trying to get people to understand the deep roots of psychosocial traumas and hierarchies. And here they are, the right wing. They know that your work is dangerous and you should be silenced. Yeah, because you are woke, and woke is bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Woke. What a ridiculous word, woke.
That's so annoying. Everything that tempers with inequality and hierarchy is woke these days. You're not allowed to say that stuff. But
I just find the word ugly, woke. I find the word ugly. I don't want to be associated with an ugly word, woke. It just
but woke originally comes from African American resistance movement. So I in that sense I feel we need to give it some respect. But I'm more annoyed by how it's now being misused to like reject anything that is about social equality because that is so-called woke. I'm very allergic to these kind of reactions, but yeah, what can we say? Peter?
An allergy to an allergy. Yeah, no, I mean,
exactly.
Most of the stuff that's being reacted against, DEI programs in large corporations, were largely a kind of, I don't know what color we would use. Let's call it woke washing, not greenwashing, not pink washing, but woke washing. And now they decided that even that kind of performative effort that wasn't going to actually solve the underlying problems that lead to racist outcomes in any country, even that's too much for them. And so now it's to be discarded.
Yeah. Well, the liberals did us a very big disservice by just abusing all these identity things for their own gain. You know what I mean? Black faces in high places and that kind of stuff, but not changing the system. That really didn't help. Help the whole.
I noticed that even with some students on the ecological crisis, like some of them reacting to the kind of corporate mainstream, a lot of talk about sustainability and green initiatives and blah, blah, blah. And their reaction to that wasn't so much that's a fake pseudo solution to a real problem, but rather, since they're talking about it, the establishment is saying that this is a threat. It must not be a threat, and it must not exist. And
well, we have taken up enough of your time, Vijay. We could spend hours on the whole
No,
question.
this is so interesting. Yeah.
Great talking with you, indeed.
We could spend hours on the question of woke. We've talked about that often with our guests, such as Professor Horn. But let's leave it here. You've already been very generous with your time. Wonderful. One of our audience favorites. So very glad to have you on again, and also one of our favorites, of course. And hopefully we will speak again in the near future. And we wish you all the best with your activist endeavors. And talk to you soon, hopefully.
Okay, take care of yourselves.
And hopefully the next time we talk, we'll have a lot more on the new mood to discuss.
Yes.
Quite right. Okay.
Excellent.
See you later.
All right. Okay.
All right. Have a good one.
Bye.
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 Bye.